Today I want to talk about two different kinds of ambiguity, and I want to explain how each of these different kinds of ambiguity can give rise to fallacies. I call them semantic and syntactic ambiguity. So what are these two different kinds of ambiguity? Let's look at some examples. So here are examples of semantic ambiguity. Semantic ambiguity is when a particular word has two different interpretations. The two different interpretations are two different interpretations of that one word. So, one example is, consider the newspaper headline, Gandhi stoned in rally in India. Well, there are two different interpretations of the verb stoned, right? One interpretation is, people threw stones at Gandhi at the rally in India. Another interpretation is, Gandhi was using illicit drugs at the rally in India. So those are two different interpretations of the word stoned, and they give rise to two different interpretations of what someone is saying when they say Gandhi stoned in rally in India. Consider the sentence, Iraqi head seeks arms. Okay, that sentence actually has two words that are ambiguous. There's the word head and there's the word arms. Head could be interpreted to mean a part of the body, right, the head, or it could be understood to mean part of the body politic, right, the head of the body politic, the Iraqi president, or the head of state, or the head of their defense department or their military department, but the head of some organization. That's to say, the leader of some organization. So the word head could be interpreted to mean the leader of some organization. It could also be understood to mean the head, the top of the body. Arms. Well, arms, of course, could be understood to mean arms, right, these appendages, or they could be understood to mean weapons. So that sentence has two words, each of which is semantically ambiguous. And then there's the sentence, Meredith is in a terrible state. Well, of course you might mean, when you say Meredith is in a terrible state, you might mean she's in a terrible psychological state. She's very depressed, she's very upset, she's very angry. Or you might mean that she's in a state, like one of the United States or one of the states of some other country, but she's in a state which is a terrible state. We don't need to name those. Okay, so these are examples of sentences that contain semantic ambiguity, semantically ambiguous expressions. Let's see how some of these give rise to fallacies. So consider this argument. Premise 1, Gandhi stoned in rally in India. Premise 2, drug users are not qualified to lead. Conclusion, Gandhi not qualified to lead. Okay, now superficially that might look like a valid argument. Right? Gandhi falls into a certain category, stoned in the rally in India. People who fall into that category are not qualified to lead, so Gandhi's not qualified to lead. But here's the thing. That first premise, as I said just a moment ago, has two acceptable interpretations. It could be understood as meaning people threw stones at Gandhi in the rally in India, or it could mean Gandhi was using illicit drugs at the rally in India. Now, if it means the second thing, then this argument is valid. Gandhi is not qualified to lead, at least given the truth of the two premises. And I'm not going to comment on the truth or falsehood of the second premise. But the most plausible interpretation of that first premise is not that Gandhi was using illicit drugs at the rally in India, it's that people threw stones at Gandhi at the rally in India. And so, on that interpretation, just because people threw stones at Gandhi at the rally in India, that doesn't mean Gandhi was using drugs. And so it doesn't mean that Gandhi falls into the category that the second premise is talking about. And so on that interpretation of premise 1, the argument is not valid. It's a fallacy. Okay, so there's an example of how the semantic ambiguity of the expression stoned can give rise to a fallacy, right? An argument that superficially seems valid, but it seems that way superficially only because we're assigning the wrong interpretation to the word stoned. Okay, Here's another example of how semantic ambiguity can give rise to a fallacy. So consider this argument. Meredith is in a terrible state. Meredith is in Texas. Therefore, Texas is a terrible state. Okay. Now, apart from the question of whether or not the conclusion is true, I'd like you to notice that if the first premise is understood as it most plausibly is understood, as meaning that Meredith is in a terrible psychological state, let's say she's depressed, or she's very anxious, or she's upset, if that's the correct way to understand the first premise, then the argument is a fallacy. I mean, superficially, it might seem valid. Meredith is in a terrible state. Meredith is in Texas, so Texas must be a terrible state. Well, superficially, that might seem valid, but it seems that way only because we're relying on one interpretation of the phrase state, terrible state. The correct way to understand premise one is on the other interpretation, the interpretation according to which a terrible state is a terrible psychological state, not a terrible political or geographical state. So when we say Meredith is in a terrible state, we're just saying that she's in a terrible psychological state. So from the fact that Meredith is in a terrible psychological state and the fact that she's in Texas, we can't infer anything about whether or not Texas, the state of Texas, is a terrible state. Nothing follows. Okay, so those are some examples of how semantic ambiguity gives rise to fallacies. Now, I said there was another kind of ambiguity, syntactic ambiguity. So what's that, and how does it give rise to fallacies? Syntactic ambiguity is when you have a phrase that can be given two different interpretations, where the two different interpretations differ in the grammar, in what grammatical categories are assigned to different parts of that phrase. So let me give you some examples to illustrate the idea. Consider the sentence, "The government asks us to save soap and waste paper." Right? Clearly, there are two different interpretations of that sentence. It might be saying that the government asks us to save two things, soap and waste paper, or it might be understood as saying that the government is asking us to do two things. First, to save soap, and secondly, to waste paper. Those are two different interpretations, and they differ not in the meaning of any particular word, they differ in how you're supposed to understand the nature of the government's request. Is the government asking us to do two things, one involving saving and one involving wasting? Or is the government asking us to do one thing involving saving, but saving two different kinds of things, soap and waste paper? So that's an example of syntactic ambiguity. Here's another example. Tuna biting off Washington coast. Again, there are two different ways to interpret this sentence. You can interpret it, perhaps most plausibly, as saying to fishermen, look, if you're interested in fishing for tuna, you should fish off the Washington coast, because if you fish off the Washington coast, you'll find that the tuna there are biting. Right? So you'll be able to catch tuna if you fish off the Washington coast. Another interpretation of that same sentence, somewhat less plausible, is to say that the tuna are biting off the Washington coast. The Washington coast is itself disappearing as the tuna bite it off. Right? And those two different interpretations differ according to whether biting is understood as a verb or biting off is understood as a verb phrase that relates tuna to the Washington coast. Okay. Finally, consider this example. Police can't stop gambling. Okay, there are two different ways of understanding this sentence. Again, two different correct interpretations, two different possible interpretations. One is as saying that there's gambling taking place and the police just can't stop it. No matter what the police do, the gambling will continue to take place because the gamblers are gambling in hidden places where the police can't find them, or the gamblers are gambling in places where the police don't have a warrant to search, but the gambling is going on and the police just can't do anything to stop it. Or the sentence could be understood as saying, the police themselves are gambling and they just can't stop. No matter how hard they try, they can't stop themselves from gambling. Okay. Two different interpretations of the sentence, police can't stop gambling. Now notice how these examples of syntactic ambiguity can give rise to fallacies. Let's consider some examples. So, consider the following argument. Police can't stop gambling. Anyone who can't stop gambling needs therapy. Therefore, the police need therapy. Now, superficially, this argument might look valid. Right? It might seem to be saying the police fall into this category of people who can't stop gambling, and anyone who falls into that category needs therapy, so the police need therapy. But that's relying on one interpretation of the sentence, the police can't stop gambling, and that's not the interpretation that's probably correct. The interpretation that's probably correct is that gambling is going on and the police can't do anything to stop it from going on. And if that's the correct interpretation of premise one, then the argument is invalid. The argument is a fallacy, right? That fact that the police can't stop gambling from going on, and that anyone who can't stop themselves from gambling needs therapy, from those two premises, that doesn't support the conclusion that the police need therapy, right? It might support the conclusion that the inveterate gamblers that the police can't stop from gambling need therapy, but it doesn't support the conclusion that the police need therapy. So that's an example of how the syntactic ambiguity in the sentence, police can't stop gambling, can give rise to a fallacy. Here's another example. Consider, premise one, the government asks us to save soap and waste paper. Premise two, it's wrong to waste recyclable resources like paper. So conclusion, the government's request is unreasonable. Okay, now superficially, again, this argument might appear to be valid because it might appear that, well, the government is asking us to do a couple of different things and it's wrong to do one of those two things, so the government's request is unreasonable. But that interpretation of premise one, according to which the government is asking us to do a couple of different things, like saving soap and wasting paper, that's not the most likely interpretation of that premise. The most likely interpretation of that premise is an interpretation according to which it's saying that the government is asking us to do one thing, to save, but it's asking us to save a couple different things, soap and waste paper. And then, from the fact that the government is asking us to save waste paper, and that it's wrong to waste recyclable resources like paper, well, it doesn't follow at all that the government's request is unreasonable. And those two premises don't at all support the conclusion. And so, given the most likely interpretation of premise one, this is a fallacy. This is a bad argument. It's a bad argument, but superficially it might seem like a good argument, again, because of the syntactic ambiguity in the phrase, save soap and waste paper. Okay, so those are some examples to illustrate how semantic ambiguity and syntactic ambiguity can each give rise to fallacies.